Thanks for the welcome and the opportunity to be part of your service this morning, and thank you to Jimmy and Nasir for doing those readings. Advocating on behalf of people seeking asylum in our country can seem a long and winding road. I want to encourage you to keep going and get involved in an initiative leading up to the next federal election. So as Margaret said, I'm part of a small team that supports the Social Justice Forum. The forum's made up of leaders in uniting in the wider church, and it sets some social justice advocacy priorities for the Synod. When I began my role in late 2013, the Give Hope Uniting for Asylum Seekers campaign was already established. I knew a little about people seeking asylum or refugees, but it was a steep learning curve for me. Around the same time though, unexpectedly and somewhat indirectly, I became involved with a group of young men seeking asylum. This happened through my daughter and soccer. At that time, Uniting ran a program for unaccompanied minors. Some of the young men were from Afghanistan of Hazara background. They were part of a larger group of Hazara men, aged from late teens to mid-20s, who had started an informal football team. They needed a coach. My daughter Bronwyn, aged 21, heard about this and put a hand up. She'd been playing football for about 5 years. Despite having absolutely no coaching experience whatever, as I said, she decided to put her hand up, and I went along as a support person. That started an 18-month journey with this group. Bronwyn, together with a uniting worker who spoke Farsi, which was very important, trained and coached the team and got them into Maryland's football club and playing in the Granville District competition. So they played a whole season in a proper competition. So Bronwyn's involvement with the guys went beyond football. She took them to hospital when they had injuries and shared many meals and social occasions with them. She helped some of them with their visa applications. She grew and learnt a lot about them, about the situation of people seeking asylum, and about herself. And as a team helper, my understanding of these young men grew and became more personal. So this experience affirms what we all know, that our awareness, attitudes and values are more likely to change when we have a personal experience of a situation. This could be through direct relationship or hearing a speaker, but it could come through a book or a film or other means, but some sort of personal contact. These sorts of experiences may fan into flame compassion and indignation at the situation of people seeking asylum in our country. But the biblical call that we've just heard about to care for the stranger in our midst has sounded out for much longer, as we just heard in the reading from Leviticus. The British rabbi and scholar, Lord Jonathan Sacks, reminds us that the two great commandments of Jewish faith are known to Christians as the Great Commandment: to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul and strength, and to love your neighbour as yourself. Jesus said that the entire law and the prophets are summed up in these two commandments. But Lord Sacks suggests there is a third important commandment in Judaism, one that is repeated some 36 times in their writings. It calls on Israel to love the stranger among them, reminding them they were strangers in Egypt. In the Leviticus passage, concern for the stranger or alien is expressed in having their basic needs met, as well as directions on how they should be treated generally. So the Israelites are told, don't reap to the very edges of your field so that the stranger will have food. They are commanded, you should do them no wrong. So that could express not taking advantage of them as a minority group or exploiting their lack of local knowledge or language. And it's also a general prohibition against harming the stranger in any way. Then more positively, the people are instructed, you shall treat the stranger who sojourns with you as the native among you, and you shall love them as yourself. The stranger is to have the same rights as the local people. They're not to be treated any differently. They're to be offered the same practical care and attention an Israelite would be entitled to. And in making these commands, the writer appeals to empathy born of common experience. For you were strangers in the land of Egypt, and its origin in the generous nature of their God. So what do these teachings on welcoming the stranger have to say about our nation's treatment of people seeking asylum? So it's clear that in the last 2 decades at least, our nation's treatment of people seeking asylum has fallen far short of the ideals and commands expressed in Leviticus. Report after report has shown that our practices of mandatory indefinite detention, agonisingly slow assessment and provision of temporary rather than permanent protection have caused real harm to people. Our policies do not treat people seeking asylum as most citizens of this country are treated. And as the Australian Human Rights Commission has pointed out, it is likely our practices have breached multiple human rights conventions. But regrettably, that argument does not appear to concern most Australians. For years now, the situation regarding people seeking asylum has appeared quite intractable and toxic. The refugee sector has been trying to find a way forward. In recent months, a consensus has emerged among several groups, including our Give Hope campaign, to focus on 3 main calls where positive change may be more achievable. We need to keep working on everything, but these are 3 areas where we think there might be more possibility of movement. And it's important to note that these 3 advocacy priorities have been influenced directly by the views and input of people seeking asylum in Australia. The priorities are: firstly, a fair process for people seeking asylum. A fair process. There are around 20,000 people in the Australian community still waiting for their refugee claims to be assessed. The system they face is unfair in several ways. The fast track, which is a somewhat ironic term, the fast track process for assessing people's claims for protection discriminates against people who came to Australia by boat. Since 2014, these people have no right to meaningful, independent review of their case. And under the limited right of appeal they do have, they can't introduce new evidence about their case or why it's unsafe to return home. And the short timeframes for filling out long and complex forms and the cuts to legal advice and support add to that unfairness. And more recently, the government has changed the eligibility criteria for what's called the Status Resolution Support Services. So the SRSS provides limited financial assistance, casework support and access to trauma counselling for people seeking asylum. The eligibility changes means that many people currently not working will lose part or all of those supports. There are very few exemptions. The Refugee Council of Australia estimates that up to 7,500 people, including many children, will be left unable to pay for housing, medical care and food. In other words, we're willing to make people destitute in our country. So we are asking that the federal government repeal the fast-track process, restore a fair and transparent assessment process with legal support and the right to independent review. We must also ensure that those seeking asylum have the income, housing and health support just to live decently while the assessment process takes place. Secondly, we're advocating for permanent rather than temporary protection. After August 2012, all people seeking asylum who arrived in Australia by boat were placed on bridging visas while they were waiting to have their claims assessed. Those found to be refugees were either placed on a temporary protection visa, which lasts for 3 years, or a safe haven enterprise visa, which lasts for 5 years. The temporary nature of both visas means that these people live in a perpetual state of uncertainty, and there are other problems. Those under temporary protection are denied the right to reunite with their families. So some have partners or children they've not seen for years. Some came here, like the people in our football team, as unaccompanied minors and are forced to live not knowing whether they'll see their parents or their brothers or sisters again. Imagine what that is like, to face that prospect of separation from the people you love. Despite being genuine refugees, those under temporary protection have to remake their case for protection every few years and face the possibility of being returned to the situation they fled. And temporary status makes it harder for people to rebuild their lives when their future is uncertain, though many are trying their best to do just that. So it's not surprising research shows higher levels of stress, anxiety, depression amongst those with temporary rather than permanent protection. So we're asking the federal government to reinstate permanent protection for those found to be refugees. And thirdly, we're calling for a larger and more responsive humanitarian program. At the end of 2017, you probably know there were 65.6 million forcibly displaced people across the world, including 22.5 million refugees. Now, most of those people just want to return to their homes, but some are unable to do so. Australia has had a well-regarded resettlement program, but the available places are limited. And due to our isolation, we have far fewer people seeking asylum than many European countries, and we know the vast bulk of refugees are hosted by poorer countries adjoining areas of conflict. The Uniting Church believes our nation can do better. There's a consensus amongst concerned groups that our humanitarian program should be increased from its current level of about 13,750 places to 20,000 places annually, and then progressively up to 30,000 places. Other issues, such as private and community-based sponsorship of refugee places, should be explored. We often read in the Gospels that Jesus was moved with compassion by the sight of human need, and then he acted to relieve that need. He was moved with pity at the man suffering leprosy and healed him. He had compassion on the widow from Nain and raised her son from the dead. He was moved by the hungry crowd and fed them. But compassion was not the only emotion Jesus felt when confronted with human need. The Gospels also describe him as indignant and angry at systems and rules that alienated or otherwise harm people. That is the case in his healing the man with a withered hand, which we heard in our Gospel reading. So both compassion and indignant anger at wrong are valid expressions of love for our neighbour. They will motivate us, as they did Jesus, not only to meet the need or address the hurt we see, but to change the unfair systems or policies that create the situation in the first place. How do we respond in a concrete way to this biblical call to welcome the stranger rather than harming them? Many concerned groups are calling on their supporters and the wider community to make their concerns known to their federal, local members of Parliament. That is the single most important thing that we are asking you to do. Our Synod's moderator, the Reverend Simon Hansard, recently emailed congregations and reminded them that the Uniting Church has a long history of defending the rights of refugees and people seeking asylum. And this congregation has been at the forefront of that defence. The moderator urged Uniting Church members in the lead up to the next federal election to visit their local MPs and talk about their concerns. That is what political insiders have told refugee advocates is necessary for change to happen. They tell us that more MPs will need to hear from ordinary people, not just the professional advocates, but from ordinary people, about why they are concerned for people seeking asylum and their conviction that our nation can do so much better. So I'm wanting you to encourage to keep doing that or to start doing that if you're not doing it. If you can organise groups of people from other faiths or members of the wider community to visit your local MP, then so much the better. And our Social Justice Forum team is available to support you in setting up and organising a group to visit. And for those who are unable to visit their MPs, and that's the situation for some people, or if you just can't imagine doing that, then write them a personal letter, because that still has a real impact. Politicians tell us that getting a personal letter still influences them. So the prospects for positive change may seem bleak at times, but we need to be persistent and to work cooperatively with others of goodwill. Such bottom-up influence is not only useful, but it's necessary for enduring change to occur. A couple of weeks ago, I heard an ABC interview with Gareth Evans, the past Australian Foreign Minister. He was being interviewed before an amnesty talk that he was giving about the United Nations doctrine of the responsibility to protect. It was a doctrine he helped introduce to address mass human rights violations and atrocities. The interviewer, Linda Mottram, pointed out that in many cases the doctrine had not been applied at all. Gareth Evans acknowledged the truth of that, although he said it had been applied preventatively at times. But then he said this: "But what is the alternative? Do we just throw up our hands and go back to the bad old days when this was regarded as nobody's business? When sovereignty was a licence to kill? Of course we can't. And that's why those of us who care, and most people around the world do, those of us who care just have to hang in there and work hard. Bottom-up advocacy through civilian action towards our governments to say, you've got to care and you've got to respond effectively when these situations erupt." So may we all continue to act in that spirit of persistence and determination to welcome the stranger in our own lives and the life of our nation. Amen.